In my podcast today, I have a guest who is an ex-Indian Air Force pilot. He is an author and a storyteller. The stories that he has shared are absolutely gut-wrenching and unbelievable. Starting off from stories of rescue missions to the rescue operation of the 2004 tsunami, up till experiences of life and death situation. He has shared a whole barrage of these stories with us. My guest, Air Commodore Nitin Sathe, who flew all the way from Pune for my podcast, has spent an amazing time in the Indian Air Force, and he is also the son of an army officer and has been able to share his life's experiences in a way that nobody else has. We discussed a battle that happened in Congo. We discussed a rescue operation where his helicopter almost crashed into a mountain. We've gone ahead and discussed the entire episode of what happened in the 2004 tsunami and a lot more. I hope you guys watch and enjoy this podcast. Welcome, Air Commodore Nitin Sathe, sir. I am really honored that you took time out, traveled all the way from Pune to Dehradun to come and be a part of my podcast. I'm absolutely elated. And I was really looking forward to this because you're an author, you're an Air Force chopper pilot, and you're the first Air Force chopper pilot that I have on my podcast ever since I've started off my podcast, sir. I'm going to jump right into my questions, and I'm really excited to hear all the stories that you brought along.
Yes. Thanks, Arun. First, I must thank you to call me over here to your beautiful studio. And it's nice to be here. And I always love to talk about the stories that I've been through, because I think they carry a lot of lessons for people to learn from, as well as they're pretty exciting all the same. Yeah.
So I saw a podcast of yours recently with Bijay Nair, sir.
Yeah.
Manu Bijay Nair. Fantastic, sir. Very friendly, very nice. He's also a very interesting person, you know. So I'm going to start off with my first question to you is that, sir, tell us something really interesting and memorable from your academy days, sir, Air Force Academy, NDA. कोई ऐसा incident बताओ, sir, जो मतलब you remember and you like talking about it, sir.
So the first day of NDA, the thing I think I will talk about today. What happened was that my mother especially was very reluctant that I joined the academy. Although my father was in the army, and he always said that you do make a good Fauji. So in that old rickety ambassador taxi with a big trunk at the back with the door of the taxi not closing, we rattled and reached the NDA wing that is at Gorpadi in Pune. And my father and mother, they came to drop me at the NDA gate. I took off the luggage was put on the ground, and there were many like me. I was one of the last ones to join the academy in my course. And everybody was already like haircut done and everything done. So they were all running around here and there. And there was this tallish gentleman, little stocky, with big, huge mustaches. No, he came running to my father. And he came and saluted my father. And he said, "Sir, what are you doing here?" So my father looked at him and then he said, "Oh, you, Rao." So Rao was his cadet when my father was posted at the IMA as an instructor.
Lovely.
And that Rao was the adjutant of the National Defense Academy wing when I joined. So I was kind of, my heart, kind of said, good, that this guy is going to help me out a little bit now to settle down. So my father, when he was leaving, he told Captain Rao, sort him out. And he left. And sort out he did. The whole night I was doing bench stretches. And I did not know whether I was coming or going. And in the morning, my hands had swelled up. I was swollen up so much that I could not eat food. I could not reach my mouth. My hands could reach my mouth. And so I was sitting at the table. So Captain Rao again arrived. So he got one more guy who had the same problem like I had. He made us sit in front of each other and made us feed each other. So that was our first day, first show at the National Defense Academy. So there are many such stories that I have, put across in my books about NDA, about flying in the Air Force Academy, which takes you through these kind of moments which are special. For example, I think I would relate one more special incident. And incidents, everybody goes through that. Is your first solo. When you first go in the air without an instructor, it is euphoric. It's absolutely wonderful to be alone in the air, and you're the king, you're the master. So when I went solo for the first time, I thought I was very bad, but my instructor didn't feel so, and he sent me up solo. So when I went up in the air without him, firstly when I was taxiing out, I was hitting the chair like he used to hit me on my knees when he used to fly. So I was hitting him. Come on, guys, kind of thing, And then I taxied out and I took off, and I was just supposed to do just 2 circuits and land. So I was singing this old Hindi number. Aaj chal ke tujhe main leke chalungi. So I was singing that and I took off. Happiness. And I was doing merrily, going around and coming back. First approach I did, went around again. And the second approach I saw, the speed was not reducing, only I was singing, what is wrong? And I was like coming at a very steep angle to the runway. I was wondering what has happened, what is wrong. And this was the time I was supposed to land.
Which helicopter were you flying?
No, that is the time I was flying the Kiran aircraft.
Kiran.
The trainer.
Yeah.
So the instructor sits at the end of the runway watching you. So he gave a call, too steep, go around. Go around means open power, go around again. So I went around, and now I came back to my senses. Bloody hell, come on. What are you doing? And I did everything as was taught to me during the training. And I came back and did a perfect landing, And I was the first in the course to go solo. So when I did the landing, there's RT silence. RT means radio to silence when a guy who goes first solo, So there is no transmission going on. So everything is quiet.
Were you scared?
No, I was scared because the second time when I went around, I said, oh, bloody hell, I can't land the aircraft. What will I do? That kind of thing. So, so when I followed the procedure properly, it was like
a lifetime memory ban jati hai.
Yeah.
That's very nice.
So वहाँ पे we land किए, and I taxied back and put my helmet under my arm like this in style. And I looked up and I saw my entire lot of course mates standing on top of the ATC on the building, watching me come in, walking in. So they must have also seen me, doing that extra one circuit and all. So I kind of sheepishly grinned at them, and they said, yeah, well done, well done.
What was that feeling inside you when you landed and you walked with your helmet? How was that feeling?
The feeling is back on terra firma, thank God. Because you're just about started flying. You're just about 20 hours in the air. Something really goes wrong at that time, you're bound to get killed. So it takes time for an aviator to kind of blossom into a real pilot. It takes time. So first solo is like every fingers crossed, aa jayega wapas.
So it is a scary feeling.
It is.
Euphoric and scary.
But then if you follow procedures, I don't think things go wrong.
You spoke about a very steep, a very deep dive. That just prompts a very strange question. I hope you're okay with it. So have you ever experienced a life and death situation? Do you have a story that you can share with us where you can literally say, I'm sure every Air Force pilot does. Do you have one?
I think everybody of us, not even every pilot, I think all of us, you drive a car, you go through a near accident in kind of situation. So in an aircraft is designed to fly. The pilot is designed to fly the aeroplane. But when both of them don't sync with each other, then the aircraft takes you for a ride or you take the aircraft for a ride. Right? So there comes a stage in your career or your, when you get sufficiently experienced that you become a little, gung-ho about things. So this is a story about a little bit of overconfidence, a little bit of luck. And I was a commanding officer of a unit in Bombay, and the person you just spoke about, Wing Commander Nijjar, was my adjutant. He was flying with me.
Oh,
And there had been an accident near Goa. An Air Force MiG-29 had crashed. Nobody knew it had crashed till then. It was missing. And so I was launched from Bombay. And we took off in one hell of a hurry. That's a different story altogether. But we took off in one hell of a hurry. We came to Pune. We found out what was the latest. And then we were going to Goa, from Pune to Goa in the helicopter. And the weather was really, really bad. It was late evening. And so we were trying to penetrate the high ground, that is the Western Ghats, to the coastline, to Goa. And we just couldn't penetrate. The helicopter doesn't fly over clouds generally. It flies with ground in contact. So we were going, and we crossed Belgaum, and we tried various points along the, along the mountain, and we just couldn't make it. So I was telling Nijjar, yaar, the guy must be, if he's alive, we're getting delayed.
You guys are flying together?
Nijjar and I, he was my co-pilot.
Okay.
So actually, I was CEO of the unit, so I fly in the co-pilot seat. He gets his captain's flying, experience. So he was at the controls, and I was. So I said, I got her. I got her means I took over the control. I said, let me try something. So I went low. I've actually dove the aircraft, or diving the aircraft into the valley, and I saw a nice white kind of a hole in the cloud next to the hill. So I said, let's try and penetrate through this.
Okay.
So I zoomed up and I tried to go through this cloud. And the moment I reached about 200-300 meters from this hole, I realized that it was the hill that was behind this hole. So I was flying the helicopter into the damn hill.
Oh God.
And it was a Mi-8 helicopter, very sluggish on power and all that. So I just kicked rudder and I put on maximum bang. My engineer almost fell out of his chair, and he was shouting, sir, and RPM and all that. RPM went all over. And I just dived the aircraft back, 180 degrees turn. Somehow managed to, when I looked right, my rotors would have kind of brushed the trees, and we got out of that place. And I told Nijjar, never do this again. So, and then we went back, and we were out of fuel. We were low on fuel, so we went back to Belgaum. Belgaum was closed. So when everything goes wrong, when one thing starts going wrong, everything starts going wrong.
Yeah.
So Belgaum airfield was closed, but we just went and blocked the aircraft on ground at Belgaum, and then waited. I said, wait now. So these kind of things, they happen with everybody. So there's a limit of the aircraft, there's a limit of the pilot, and there is this little risk-taking ability, or risk-taking this thing where you say, okay, the weather is good, my fuel is okay, other side is likely to be good. So you take calculated decisions and do, in military flying especially. So we take some decisions which are 50-50 or 60-40 rather. But sometimes things go wrong, and this is what happened when we tried to go and rescue the pilot. Unfortunately, that guy had already died in that crash, so we would have killed ourselves too.
What exactly had happened, sir?
The MiG-29 had taken off from Adampur to Ozar, that is in Maharashtra, that's Nasik, for overalls. It was going for a major overall to Nasik, and that's a story that I wrote in my book, by the way.
Okay.
So it was about procedures. So there was a procedure where you start, intake of oxygen is started on ground when you take off. So there was a leak in the oxygen system. So this aircraft went for takeoff and came back because there was a leak. There's not enough oxygen to take him up to Ozar. So he came back, and they found out that the valve of the oxygen system was leaking. So they didn't have a spare valve. So they told him, you close the system, you climb above 10,000 feet, and then open the system and fly to Ozar. You'll save that much of oxygen. So our man took off. This is not in their books.
Yeah.
He forgot to open the oxygen system.
I was about to ask you, is it by the book?
It was not by the book. So it was a kind of a hurried decision taken at the lower level that the aircraft has to reach Ozar. There were all pressures coming from everywhere. The aircraft has to reach. So our man forgot. Oxygen. There was no oxygen above 10,000 feet. He collapsed in the aircraft itself, and the aircraft flew on its own all the way, crossed Ozar, went into Goa sector and crashed when the fuel ran out.
In the mountains.
Yeah, it was in the mountains, little mountains short of Goa. Yeah, south.
Which year was this?
Oh, this was in 2001 or 2. 2002, I think. 2002.
Which is the toughest rescue operation that you've been a part of?
Every time you do a rescue, you are kind of pushing the aircraft and yourself to the limit. Where, especially when you do rescues in the hills, which are not simple rescues because there's no place to land. There is everything is against you basically. So I will now give you a story that again was one of our books. It's about a rescue that we did of an Australian mountaineer in the hills of Uttarakhand. In Harsil, you know Harsil. So Harsil ke aage Gangotri is there. So he was climbing ahead of Gangotri. This guy. They were a team actually. And this guy had this standard hypo problems, lack of oxygen and the effects thereof. And we were kind of, we were there that day doing something else. So we got a call that there's a rescue required. So it was a civilian rescue, so a military aircraft going for a civilian rescue. It takes a little bit of time for the, for the permissions to come. See, however, I just rang up my boss and from there, whatever lines were there, there were no mobiles then. So we rang up on the military line to Bareilly from where we were flying. I spoke to my boss. I said, sir, there's a rescue. He says, okay, go ahead and do it. We'll get the permissions. So we took off and the aircraft was taken to 22,300 feet, which is way beyond the limits of the aircraft. We were down, we had taken the least amount of fuel, just about 100 liters of fuel for that sortie. We went there and where we were supposed to land, that man was not there. If he had waited for him to come there, it would have been another 3-4 hours. And that was the end of the day. So we couldn't have rescued him. So we decided to go next to the hill where he was. We saw him. We saw the whole party going with him on the stretcher along that little snowy slopes. So we went and kind of went near them and there was a little ledge there on which only one ski could come. So we put one ski on this ledge and we held on to power. The rotors were almost kissing the ice and snow on the side. And I opened the door. One chap was on the controls. I opened the door. We pulled him in like this. I don't know from where I got that strength. And the guys also pushed him in. We pulled him into the helicopter. He was lying down on the floor. His legs were dangling outside. I held the door against the Cheetah helicopter. Yeah. Nice flimsy door. So I held the door against his legs and we took off. Oh God. And we were down to 60 liters by then. And it was just about 10-15 minutes flying from Harsil. So we had enough fuel to reach Harsil. So, but the red light was coming on, telling you that the fuel is low. So with this man half hanging outside, I mean, beyond his knees were outside the aircraft. He was half inside. He was in a daze. And we got him. Moment we landed at Harsil, our man just got out of the aircraft and walked. Because now we were at 8,000 feet. So he was back to normal. And he said, thank you very much. Thank you for rescuing me. I said, my God, we have played with our lives. We've rescued a guy and look at him. He's happy. So we were very happy about...
How did you get that information that he stuck over there?
So, back then also technology was pretty high stuff for those guys. They had satellite phones to their embassies, to their countries. So they rang up. It came from the Australian High Commission. The request came to the MOD. And from the MOD to us, So their mountaineers were well equipped to be in contact with the real world when they are up there. I have seen this during my tsunami days also, where they used to kind of interview us like this, and they used to send the tapes across. It used to go by some aircraft somewhere, from there to go to Delhi and then or wherever, and then get transmitted 2 days later. The Japanese came there. He just put one antenna outside my office like this, put it into his laptop, and he was interviewing me So I said, have you taped it? He said, no, it's gone live in Japan. So I said, how? I said, I was speaking in English. He said, no, we've got a system in which the in Japanese it will keep coming as a scroll below this thing, and it was like it was transmitted live during news in Japan.
Wow.
So that was in 2003, 2004 tsunami.
The Japanese, they're quite tech savvy.
So technology. Then these guys also had got good stuff.
So you mentioned about tsunami. I want to ask you about the tsunami rescue, and I want you to share the details with me. It's a very tragic incident, but I want you to share the story with me and how were you a part of it and what all happened during that time.
Oh, it's a long story. But anyway,
We will
a
a lot of time.
Yeah. So you see this book here? It's called A Few Good Men and the Angry Sea. Okay. So that is my first book, by the way. My first book that I wrote about my experiences of the tsunami of 2004. So that is the time I was posted in Patiala, and I was having a good time with my little children. My parents were at home. There was a whole lot of people at home, and we were having a kind of barbecue session outside. And so my daughter came running to me and said, Baba, tsunami, what is tsunami? So I said, I don't know what is a tsunami. So she said, no, there is tsunamis happened. So I said, what is tsunami, beta? So she says, come and see the TV. I saw on news something has happened. So I said, we'll see it later. Ready. We were with friends, that other people had come over. We were sitting outside having a drink around the fire. So later on at night, about 10:30, I went and put on TV and I said, what is this? So then that is the time, the first of the news of actual devastation caused.
Where were you posted, sir?
I was in Patiala then.
Okay.
So I saw that and I said, oh my God, Karnikobar, the base that my friends were in, I was devastated. So it was, they was just saying that we don't know what is happening in Karnikobar, but there have been many deaths. So I picked up the phone and rang up my boss. I said, sir, I want to go. I want to go for the rescue and relief work. He said, don't be silly, you got to command this place. I said, I've got nothing to do here. Let me go. He says, no, we'll see. So I kept the phone down. Next morning, promptly, I got a call from air headquarters that I've been selected to head the team of rescue, relief and rehabilitation. And we were picked up by an aeroplane from Chandigarh and taken straight to Delhi. From Delhi, we flew to Chennai to Port Blair, and then to Karnikobar. So that was my entry into this. Since I thought I had volunteered, so what had happened was 2 or 3 names were given to the chief, and the chief gave a tick on my name, and I went. Now we were 70 of us pushed into this thing, and 2 aircraft were flown in, and we landed up at a base which we had never thought we would. Everything around was done and dealt with, in the sense there were bodies lying around, all the houses were damaged. There was absolute chaos, mayhem on the station, and these guys who were there, who had survived the tsunami, they were to be picked up by the same aeroplane that dropped us. Okay. So what happened was that within that half an hour, 1 hour that the aircraft was refueled and all that, it was time to be on your own. They went and we were like, oh, this base is ours now and we have to start from scratch. We didn't know where was what. We didn't know the road. Roads were all not there anyway. So we didn't know which direction was north, yeah. So we had to start from scratch. And the chief told me, the vice chief had come along and he said, how many days do you want to rehabilitate? So I said, 100 days, sir. So he said, 100th day I'll send the fighters here. I said, done, sir, the deal. So it's a kind of bet with the vice chief that I had. So we started working. What is work out there? Work was to first rescue whatever we could, whoever was surviving, to be rescued and put back to the mainland. The other part was to get things cleared up. It was a Safai wala kind of.
Sir, I have a question over here. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
For the rescue mission, what was the kind of equipment? What was the transport vehicle? What did you have, sir?
No. All the island, everything was local. Even we were kind of, we were inside our own base. We couldn't even go outside our own base because there was no road. There was water everywhere. There was no road. So we had to trek it across everywhere that we had to go and find this thing. But first, our task was to rescue people within the base. So we had lost 126 guys on base itself, out of the 500-600 that were there. So there were there were mothers running around trying to look for their children. There were husbands trying to find their wives. There were wives trying to find their husbands. They were crying. They were shouting. So all this was happening. That had to be controlled. So within our own base, there was chaos. Outside was worse. I mean, worse in the sense. But I must tell you here that I admire the tenacity and the resilience of the locals. They really got back to their normal selves very fast. They lost lives. They came in, they re-established their house, whatever little they could on the roadside, started living off whatever was there. We were like waiting for ration to come and that kind of stuff, you know. So going back to the story, I remember the rescues were by and large over in the 3-4 days. I mean, nobody can survive beyond that, except for one girl. In fact, I must tell you, we must interview her. She's a fantastic girl. She lives in Hyderabad. And she was on a door of a house and she drifted into the sea. And she tells me that she had rattlesnakes it was like the Noah's Ark, you know. She had some animals on the boat trying to survive and she was floating into the sea. And how that all happened is a different story altogether. And whenever an aeroplane or something was to cross across, she used to keep waving. But there was so much of wood, so much of stuff into the sea that we couldn't make out that there was some human being on that, right? So 3 days or 4 days later, she was washed ashore at a different beach on the island, and she was completely dehydrated by then and all that. So she found a suitcase, most probably of a newly married couple, because she found some ladies' clothes, young girls' clothes, which were oversized. She was 13 years old, so she wore those clothes. And she was crying and sitting around knowing what to do. When a tribal found her and then took her home. And then she said, then he knew that because that was the only airbase on the whole island. There was everybody else were tribals. So then he got her to us on the base. And then we kind of rescued her back. Meanwhile, her father, mother, and her brother all had perished.
So you're telling me this 13-year-old girl was floating on a plank in the ocean for 3 days?
3 days, yeah. Well, that's quite a story. She tells me about that. And she's an architect. She lives alone in Hyderabad. And she must be 34, 35 years old.
Mm.
And very brave, very confident. So she's adopted the family that rescued her. Every year she goes down there, and a very poor farmer's family kind of thing, lives in a hut. So she goes there every year. She's like a daughter to them. No? So she goes there, looks after them, all that.
She lost her own family?
Yeah. Nobody survived in her family.
What was the death toll during that tsunami, sir?
The death toll on our island was 4,500 people out of a total population of 20,000. 20,000.
1/4 of the population was wiped out.
Yeah. And the total death toll, you see, the total population of the entire South Nicobar Islands, that's Nicobar Islands, was about 40,000. So about 10,000 of here to have gone. Because there are some islands which is just about 15, 17 people. There are some islands with a little bit of naval presence. There are some islands with almost nobody. There's just 2 families there types. So there were a fair amount of destruction. But you know what? There's an interesting story. I must conclude this part. It's a very interesting story. The locals knew about the tsunami that was coming.
In advance?
In advance.
How many hours?
Oh, they told 7 days before. 7 दिन पहले बता दिया था कि there's going to be an earthquake and a tsunami.
How?
So this is the story. That there is a fish that lives at the bottom of the ocean, which is red in color. And when it gets caught in the nets, it means that there is disturbance on the ocean floor. And there's an earthquake pending. So when lots of these red fish were being caught, these guys realized that there was a lot of disturbance happening. And the folklore, the stories go that 99 years ago, there was a tsunami in the Andamans, and that is the time when the red fish were caught. So these stories were handed down generations, And so these guys went to the local district administration and told them there's a massive earthquake coming. So they said, okay, we'll see. Earthquakes are very common there, by the way. It's a zone 5 zone. So Earthquakes are very common. So these guys went, and the administration said, we'll see when it happens. And when it happened, there was... people who knew about this kind of stayed away from the ocean. People who had prior this thing. There are some places in Indonesia where, in fact, around Chennai, where not a single life was lost. Why? Because somebody from Indonesia, some farmer's son who was in Indonesia, sang up and said, "Tsunami aane wala hai. Just tell everybody not to go to the sea and go on to high ground and wait." And rest of the villages had casualties all over, and that particular village was zero casualty. So it was just an advance warning that was required for a tsunami, and you get adequate warning. The wave travels at just about 700 kilometers an hour under this ocean bed. And when it hits you, it takes that much time. So it took 45 minutes to reach where we were, 400 kilometers away from the epicenter. The waves reached Africa. They killed people in Africa.
True.
You see? So if we had the knowledge of it, like if my daughter had told me, I had known about the tsunami, I would have kind of, the earthquake above, it was a 9.1, 9.2 on the Richter scale. So if people knew, lesser lives would have been lost.
Okay. So is there the kind of life that you've led in the armed forces, you're an army officer's son, you were in the Air Force. Have you had a life-changing experience that has stuck with you?
This is what I just told you about. To live off the land, to live, eat leftovers, food from people who were dead, their places, their homes for a few days, eating out of a plastic bottle, cut oblong, and having no water to drink, nowhere to go to do your ablutions. Start from there and then build up the base to having your own little hut made and all that. So that entire journey of kind of rehabilitating that base and seeing what can go wrong and what could go in your life. So I always, when you don't have a fan over your head or the lights have gone, you start gripping, garmi ho raha hai, light nahi hai, and keep gripping about things. Over there, there were no lights. You were under the sky at night when you were sleeping. There were mosquitoes trying to kill you. There were mosquitoes which killed. Cerebral malaria you get out there. So everything was against you. But we fought our way through it and we remained happy through this whole thing. Because the kind of experience that it gave me was to never give up, never give up. And secondly was that if things can go wrong, they will. And it could have been worse. If you have an accident, it could have been worse. That kind of thing. So you always feel कि अच्छा इतना हो गया और इससे बुरा भी हो सकता था. Now we are safe. Let's go forward rather than crying over what has happened. So this whole thing was a life-changing experience for me. And just after this, I wrote a book on one of my friends, which you can maybe, if we have time, we'll discuss. It's called Born to Fly. It's about a paraplegic friend of mine, quadriplegic friend of mine, a fighter pilot who...
So please tell me.
So you want to do that now?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So the story is about resilience. And there was this friend of mine who came from a very small village south of Trivandrum. Okay. And he, kind of worked his way up to join the Sainik school from class 4th onwards. Worked his way up to join the academy. Did very well at the National Defence Academy. In fact, very good in ground subjects, very good in PT. Everything was good at. So we reached the Air Force Academy. Extremely good in flying. In fact, he bagged the best in flying trophy.
What's his name?
MP Anil Kumar. I was going to come to that, but anyway, flying officer MP Anil Kumar. Okay. So he used to write flying officer Anil Kumar MP. So he used to say member parliament type. So he was actually his MP is his father's. That's how they do it in Kerala.
Yeah.
Sure. So MP was a nice, fun-loving guy, and we were in NDA together, and we passed out. He was, I think, third or fourth in the order of merit when he passed out. From a guy who came from he didn't know a word of English when he joined the Sainik school to where he went. Amazing journey. So he was posted to Pathankot, where I was posted a little later to Pathankot, and from he went to fighters, I went to helicopters. So we went underwent helicopter training. He underwent his MOFs training in MOF 2, that is MiG operational flying training. So he did it in Tezpur and then got posted to Pathankot. So while he was there, he was selected as the best guy in flying and best something. All the trophies that you can think of in the squadron, he was bagging them. So he was doing very well, and people, we all knew that he was Air Marshal banega. And one fateful day when he was coming back on his bike at night, he had just ferried the aircraft from Ozar to base, and they were supposed to do night flying, so he stayed on in the squadron. And it started raining, the night flying got cancelled. People went home. He said, let me finish my paperwork that I have not been able to do in the last 7-8 days, that I have not been here. So he was doing the paperwork in the squadron and the lights went off. Now, in those times, there were no generators and all that, So he says, so he started his bike light and tried to work on that next to the... But there was too much of thundering going on. He said, enough is enough. Let me get back home. So he put his knapsack at the back and started his bike. It was a Hero Honda. Okay, choti wali. And he was driving through and he crashed into at just about 20 kilometers an hour. He crashed into a barrier, a wooden barrier which had been erected when he was not there. And the barrier was down. There was no lights on the barrier. So he saw it too late. He would have taken it on his chest and fallen off, but he ducked. So he hit it on his helmet. He broke his third vertebra. Okay. And he was lying down on the ground. And there was no scratch on his body. 20 kilometers an hour, bike went one side, he went well on one side. So the guard who was standing there, they all rushed. There was a Gadi coming, ambassador car coming back to the mechanical transport section. So they stopped, they picked him up. How did they pick him up? They picked him up with his legs and his hands. So his neck went further back and the entire bone that was broken, it cut through the entire spinal column. So he was rendered a quadriplegic. Quadriplegic is nothing below his neck. Only thing that he had was his mind that was working. So I write in my book, that, if you have your full body going without a brain, or you got your brain without your body going, which is better? I mean, it's a difficult task, but I feel that if you have a brain, then you can do a lot of things. So our man was boarded out of the Air Force, and the story is there. So he met a nurse, and he was in hospital. He fell in love with her. She fell in love with him, whatever. And she kind of encouraged him to start writing. So he started writing with his mouth. And the first thing that he wrote was her name on a piece of paper and gave it to her. And that's how his writing journey started. He wrote with his mouth. He wrote articles with his mouth. And the first of his article, which he wrote, called Airborne to Chairborne, was published in one of the national dailies in as is where is condition. I mean, they didn't print it. They just copied it onto the paper. It was a massive, big thing because it was in the mouth writing. Beautiful. If I show it to you in the book, you'll be able to see what mouth writing is all about. I mean, it's fantastic. So his first, once he started writing, then we got him a computer. So he had friends like course-mates, friends, school friends, whole lot of people, the Malayali gang in Pune, everybody looking after him. So there's a place called Paraplegic Home where he kind of was put there for the rest of his life. For 26 years, he was there. So how he now managed his life is an amazing story.
I can't imagine.
So I went and did this whole digging up. I went and stayed in his home, ate from the plate that he used to eat from, went and slept in his bed, went and met his sisters, his mother, everybody. Then went and stayed in the school with the children that he went to. Saw how it was to live in Austin. I became him. And then I wrote the story of his life.
Wow.
So this story is all about resilience, about how, a guy can come out of even if you don't have hands and legs. He wrote for, you name the magazine and he's written it for. From the Defense Reviews to international magazines to Times of India, Indian Express, you name them, The Hindu, Center Page, all kinds of articles. And not only on military topics, sports, adhyatmak stuff, anything. So he is so well read. Yeah. So
I'm going to take a photograph of that particular page from your book.
yeah.
And I'm definitely going to show it on our podcast. I'm saying it on camera because this is a gut-wrenching story.
Yeah, it is not so gut-wrenching. People thought that I've written a very negative kind of story or a very sad story. It is about why he has become the way he is. It's about the training that he had in NDA, about the training that he had in the school, his upbringing, his Kerala, upbringing is different than the other places. So he was, in his mind, he was so resilient that nothing could stop him. Nothing. I'll just end this with a small thing that when he was being transferred from Pathankot to Delhi, he told his friends that in Delhi, he said, I know the doctors have given up. So give me something, I'll want to finish it here and now because I'm going to be a burden on many people for the rest of my life, whatever life I have left. So we told him we'll wait for 5 years. If you don't get anything good to do by then, or if you don't recover, then we will give you this goli that you want to have to kill yourself. So 5 years later, to the day, our man messaged us. That time emails were on, so he messaged us from his computer that 5 years are up. I don't want to die anymore.
Is he alive?
He just died in 10 years ago. I wrote a book. I wrote
age.
He died at the age of 50 years and 15 days. He got injured at the age of 24 years. So 26 years in a wheelchair is, when we sent his documents to the US to some doctors to get some, we tried a whole lot of things on him to get him going. Because nerve tissues regeneration was, not heard of and still being researched actually. So when we sent these papers to the US to the best in New York, they said, when did this guy die? He said, no, he's still alive and kicking. So he said, impossible to believe that a guy with quadriplegia has lived so long.
Yeah.
And so active. So this whole story is worth reading. This book is now being made into a film, yeah. So hopefully, in Bollywood. So hopefully it should be a film very soon. I'm looking for people who can make it for me. There have been 1,000 requests for a film, but it's not been fructifying for the last few years. But I have hopes. I have hopes, and I know it will happen. It will happen. One day it will happen. And I want more and more people to read this book about resilience. It has been converted into 8 languages already, including Braille, by the way. I got it done in Braille. And so more, it should reach the, everybody around in our country so that nobody gives up. In the pandemic, people used to come and tell me, "Arey, mar gaye, hum to kaise jiyenge iske aage," and all that. People committed suicide, for stupid reasons. And pandemic, I thought was the biggest learning experience for all of us. You take it positively and think we'll kind of.
A lot of people changed during pandemic.
Yeah.
I was going to ask you, sir, that, share a story about someone that you knew closely who, you lost and it had a deep impact in your life. But I think you've already covered that and you've covered that beautifully.
Yeah.
Is there any other story? Is there any other story that you want to
14 due to blood cancer in Pune. And in fact, I start this book with him. That in that electric crematorium, the body is kept in that metal thing and it rolls down the runway kind of thing and goes inside the blaze. So him moving on that was like rolling for takeoff. It was final takeoff into the skies. So I start the book with him rolling for takeoff and for his final sortie into the blue yonder. So it starts like that, and then I take you back into time and from his childhood when he was born and all that. So yeah, so it was good. It was a fantastic association with him. He's an amazing person, and he is still alive. I always feel that he's alive around me, so I don't feel really too much about it. But I've been sad. There've been so many friends, so many who have lost. All of us lose friends on our way in our lives, but to lose them at a young age when they're fighting fit, and you suddenly go and you find one day you go up in a sortie and doesn't come back, and then all hell breaks loose. So it can happen to anybody. It can happen to you walking down the street. Somebody kills you and goes away. There have been accidents here a few days ago. People drove happy in a car and next moment they won.
Yeah.
So, I mean, these things happen. I always take death as something that has to happen. It happens earlier. It's tragic, but one has to get out around it and carry on with life.
It reminds me of a very famous quote by Mike Tyson, where he says that we all have a plan till we get punched on the face.
Yes, yeah.
So I mean, we can plan life as much as we want, but when life decides to punch you on the face, all your plans go sideways. So with that, I want to ask you another question, which is with regards to a case study that, you might have been taught, or a case study that was shared during your academy days with regards to the 71 war, or something to do with the Kargil war, which has been very effective in terms of learning. If there's something that you can share as a story.
Right. So I wrote this book called 1971.1999 War Stories. So last year, I think. It was last year, yeah. So what I did was I contacted my father's friends who were there with him in 71. And I got some humane and human stories about the war, which were never published, So there are stories of wars where, you say so many squadrons were there and they've bombed the hell out of so-and-so place and so many people died and so all this happened, so many bullets were fired. This ground was recovered and this ground was lost. So that's all been done and dusted. So what happened in the minds of people? What happened to the families who were at home? So I started to write about these kind of stories, and which I started interviewing people, old people, 80, 85 years old now, who were there during the war. So 71 war, I got nice stories about crashing into Pakistan, getting caught by the Pakistani and come back after a year. Then I got stories about families, how they were connected with their folks at the war front, how they didn't have money over here. So what did the commanding officer wife do? She went to the bank. She, pleaded in front of the bank manager, got 20,000 rupees and gave 200 rupees to each of the ladies so that they could survive. So these are stories which are never been told. I mean, these are also stories of the war.
Mm.
So I decided to write these kind of stories. And about Kargil, Kargil is all about innovation. Kargil is all about innovation, in which what I did was I contacted all my friends and people who were in Kargil, and I got inputs from them, and I wrote about this. So Kargil is about innovation in the sense the GPS was in its infancy in India, so it was not on the aeroplane. So GPS was used for the first time to get from place A to place B accurately. GPS was also used to bomb these places in Kargil, to be strapped onto a bomb. That was again innovation. And the Indian Air Force had never fought a war at that altitude. We were never used to flying and firing at 15,000 feet and 20,000 feet at targets. So the aircraft performances and everything is different over there. So it was a big, big learning curve for the armed forces in general, and Air Force in particular, because our technology that we had was being used at much lower levels. So we were flying from Srinagar, but we were flying it, and firing at 18,000 feet, which we had never done. Okay, so there are stories about all this which kind of bring out the thing that in our armed forces, we can do anything with whatever we have and succeed. Despite the fact that we were not geared up for it, but we did succeed. So, but it was at a huge loss of human lives, yes. But then we learned a lot from that. So these are the stories there are so many stories. Actually, I can't really pinpoint this thing, but I think there are enough and more stories to learn from for all of us. the Kargil Review Committee, for whatever it is worth, whatever has been implemented, partially implemented, I think it needs to be a little more serious about implementation of learnings from.
Do you think that the Kargil war brought the Triforce together in communication better?
Yes, but it all, and no also. When it started,
Could you expand on that?
yeah. In the beginning, the army did not want to kind of tell the Air Force, come and help us out. Because they themselves didn't want to believe that incursion has taken place. So there was a lack of intelligence, there was intelligence available. In fact, I met a colonel who told me that he was flying in Kargil 1 year before the war, and he had seen footsteps in the snow in the bunkers that we had withdrawn from for the winters. And he had gone and reported the matter 1 year before that there are people there.
Are you talking about Colonel Lalit Rai?
No, I'm talking about Colonel Ranade.
Okay.
So he was flying there that time. And he had given this input, and nothing was acted upon. So it was a lot of our failures also, but which we should not put under the carpet. We should learn from what we did wrong, and we should go on and not do them again. Rather than, saying that everything was hunky-dory and we'd won the war. No, we won the war at a huge cost, which could have been avoided. Right? So yes and no. That is why I said yes and no. Then the bonhomie started when at the highest level, the chiefs had to come and say, no, okay, you want help? We are there. Those kind of things happened. And then the Air Force came into the battle a little late. We could have come much, much earlier.
So what did Kargil change for the forces in India?
Kargil changed. Firstly, is the way we train for battle at high altitude. So we are going to fight battles with China at altitudes. So we started gearing up for battles at altitude 1. Equipment. The kind of equipment that came in after the Kargil war, we were flying in, those 15 kg heavy, heavier stuff. Today we have got very lightweight clothing. We got excellent, mountaineering clothing, which is so lightweight and it can be used and over again. And it serves its purpose rather than those kind of old, the tarpaulin kind of stuff that we used to wear. They were horrible. We used to fly in that. It was horrible to even control the aeroplane with those heavy coats that we used to wear. So the equipment that came in was good. The aircraft got modified for operations at high altitude. Practice bombing, practice firing at high altitude started for the Air Force. The Indian Army, of course, has been operating at altitude for a long time. We've been Siachen Glacier operations have been there on for 40 years plus. So the helicopter operations in the Siachen have been going on. So those are separate. Those are mail delivery and weapon. Logistics operation basically. But offensive, first time.
So that means during Kargil, it was not an intelligence failure. It was not taken that seriously.
It was intelligence failure. Who says no? I think it was intelligence failure. Whatever I have read at least. And we didn't act upon actionable intelligence that we had. We said, no, we'll further confirm. Satellite imagery was not so good then. Today we have, this is one more thing that has happened. Today we have satellite imagery, we can look into the other side. We have got good recce platforms which can go and get you accurate information about what is happening on there.
I recently interviewed the former director of Ordnance, Mr. Hari Mohan. He spoke about some technology which is absolutely mind-blowing. What India is developing now is to reckon with. I mean, it's fantastic. Drone technology and those, there are these radars which are actually not radar, they're dummy radars. It is just to kind of, create a distraction for the enemy. When I heard about the kind of tech that we are working on now, it's fantastic.
Yeah.
So, my next question to you is about a combat situation that you were in and it went against you. Can you tell us a story?
Combat situations going against. Okay, fine. So let me narrate an incident where I was in Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there's a whole lot of fighting going on, and it was 2006. I reached Congo as one of the commanding officers of the attack helicopter units there. So we had total of 8 helicopters in Congo, attack helicopters available. And what was happening there was that the militants were actually ex-military in the Congo. I mean, they were factions. So there were self-styled generals who used to just come up and say, okay, you come with me and let's fight our own army. So they were fighting amongst themselves and we were in the crossfire. And we were supposed to keep peace. We were a peacekeeping force. Okay. So we were not operating under Chapter 7 in which use of force is permitted officially. Right? So that was a special dispensation given. Okay, in case you are threatened, then you can, for your own, saving your own life, you can use the weapon. Okay. So what had happened was that there was this General Henry Nakunda, I think his name is. Nakunda is correct, but whether it's Henry or what, but Nakunda. So General Nakunda. Okay. So he and his about 10,000 troops he gathered. And they were marching towards Goma, where we were staying. It was night and the fight was going on between the Congolese army and Henry Nakunda's army. Okay, the fight was going on, firefights were going on. And the advance was from a place called Sake, S-A-K-E, Sake, towards Goma. So we got information that we have to stop them anyhow because once they enter Goma, they will come and ravage the entire place. Looting, raping, the works. And they will burn all our helicopters and that's the end of it. That will be end of United Nations missions in Congo. So a decision was taken at the highest level in New York and we were allowed to use air weapons against these guys. So it was a night operation, started at night actually. It was late evening in fact. And I was the flight commander there, so I was the first sortie to get airborne with a young pilot who was flying in the captain's seat. I was in the front seat. Okay. Tandem seating in the attack helicopters. And so we were told by the Sake Brigade that, by the way, we were with the Chinese and Pakistanis fighting alongside against the common enemy. First time that we fought alongside the Pakistanis.
India, China and Pakistan fighting together against the Congolese.
Yeah.
Wow.
So there were all kinds of troops there. So we were Pakistanis and we are the major contingents, fighting contingents actually. So we got information that the leader, Henry Nakunda's ke jo leaders the 5 or 6 of them, they were in one jeep and they were heading out of Sake going into the hills. So we were told that you please target them because they are the masterminds. So we got airborne and we saw this jeep exiting Sake into the jungle and it was following a jungle road and climbing up into the hills. So we tried to take a shot at him along the road and the moment he used to see the helicopter coming, he used to go into the bush. Okay, and we just couldn't get him. So finally I locked on my cameras on my systems to this jeep and I said, let's go and hover a couple of kilometers away and absolutely low level, deck level, or just over the tree, in between the trees we were flying slow. And we had this guy on the sides. So they started moving again and I said, let him move. Huh? And moment they started moving up the hill, they were in clear view. And now they had no other way to go anywhere. So this is the time we decided that we just pulled up and we came, the vehicle came 90 degrees to us along a road and we were like going in for the attack and with all our rockets. So we fired 16 rockets at them at this jeep. And thankfully luck was good. It was with us. We hit them. And when we went there, it was a mangled mass of metal that was left of the jeep. And there were a few bodies lying around and the other guys who had fled the scene. So thanks to this particular sortie that we did to stop the militants, we call them militants then, that the entire operation came to a standstill and Henry Nakunda withdrew his troops back into the hills to fight another day. So we saved Congo from, being attacked by these guys. So it really didn't go against us, but it could have gone majorly against us had we not used a weapon against So I've written in my book that, we are fighting a war which is not ours. We are fighting an enemy which we don't know who's the enemy in this whole thing. And we are still getting bullets into our aeroplanes. And what is it all for? What is it all for? What kind of peace? Are we going to really get peace in Congo by doing all this? So I've written a little story about my first combat experience of killing somebody. Actually, I knew that I had killed somebody. And because the next day, the bodies used to come and get buried right next to our base. The burial ground was there. They used to come in trucks. Bodies used to be loaded up in trucks, got there and buried. It was that, stupid, if I may call it, stupid war where, everything was happening together. I mean, they were from the same villages that they were fighting against. I mean, they were from locals.
This is the first time I am hearing a combat story where India, Pakistan and China come together to fight another rebel.
We were part of the UN troops, so we don't become India, Pakistan, we are United Nations.
United Nations. Okay.
So we fly under one flag.
So very interesting stories. I mean, I really hope, and I'm saying this to my audience, that I hope these stories inspire them, especially the youth, to join the armed forces, because the armed forces is not a job. It's a way of life.
Yeah.
And eventually it's a family. Everybody knows everybody. Yes. Fantastic. How do you become an author? I mean, from guns to helicopters, combat, and now an author.
Author was just by a stroke of the tsunami, if I may call it. Right? So before that, you said you're motivating the youth. I've written a beautiful book, which is just being released now. It's called SSB Simplified. So I was the president of the SSB and I wrote this book. And I have written it in a story form as to what you would encounter when you go to get selected to the armed forces. You don't need to go to any of these coaching classes where they take lots of money from you. You need to prepare yourself, and how to prepare yourself, I have given out in this book, and how to join the armed forces and what we need in the armed forces. That's what I've given this. Coming back to the question that you had asked was about, what is that?
How did you become an author?
So Tsunami, I started writing a little diary. First time I had a laptop in my life. It was issued to me by the government. So I had a laptop, so I started using it. I was putting in my daily whatever routines that I was doing. So everything was there. So about a year later, I came out of there and I went to Congo from the frying pan to the fire, as they say. So from Tsunami, I went to Congo to fight another war. And I forgot about it. And unfortunately, this particular computer that I left behind with my notes crashed. I mean, nothing could be recovered. So my story was actually lost. So my friends, who's my best friends, in fact, they're in Rediff.com. So they said, no, you start writing your story. And I don't know, thankfully, I think God has given me a fairly good recall memory. So I could recall daily occurrences of what happened in the tsunami. So I started writing kind of a diary again after 8 years of the tsunami. And I kept writing. And I said, yeah, we can convert it into a book. So then the editors got in and they did what they had to do. And so that's how my first book was born. And it was written from my heart. So it came out pretty well. I feel so, and people also tell me that. I'm not bragging. But it was from the heart, so it was a story well told. And then it was taken up for research by people. And I saw that people wanted to know all this. So then I started my storytelling sessions and all that I do. The other books that I wrote, the Born to Fly and all these books, are again from my real life incidents. Like Born to Fly is about my own friend, is the biography. Then I wrote short stories about everything that I have been through, from rescues to climbing a mountain to meeting people on an aeroplane to what have you. How to when I was teaching a young lady pilot for the first time in the cockpit, how did it feel to have a lady in the cockpit? So those kind of things I have put down in my story. I made them interesting so that it is just not that, ladies came to the Air Force and they started flying. So what was the change? It was not like that. By telling a story in a different manner, I take you into the cockpit and make you realize what it is to be there. For example, in the tsunami, I'll make you feel that the wave is coming towards you. So I realized that I had this little, God-given gift to explain things in a manner that, appeals to the person who wants to listen to it. or read it. So then all my other stories are actually about all my life experiences. So it is like that. It just happened. One happened, then it's every year I've got 7 now under my belt. I'm writing one more, which is almost ready. So it just spurs me on. And the second book, of course, The Born to Fly, got me a best non-fiction novel for 2016-17. So that was like, I have become an author nowadays. It's the second book of mine. So they found it worthy of being the best, the non-fiction. So I said, I'm good.
Fantastic.
So that's how my stories began. Yeah.
So, any story, interesting story, which is close to your heart that you want to share with us?
Okay. There's so many of them, but I think I will stick to a very, very nice one, which I saved by a chit. I call it saved by a chit of paper. So there was this now Lieutenant General Narayan Chatterjee, retired, very, very famous guy in the armed forces, in the flying circles. He's a helicopter pilot. He's one of the original lot who flew helicopters in the army.
Okay.
So he was posted in Jammu flying the Krishak aircraft, those little aircraft that were used for observations. So he was flying the Aeropi aircraft in ex-Jammu. And I will not go through the whole story. It's there in the book. One can read it. But what happened was the Battle of Cham was in the offing, and the artillery guns were supposed to fire, 108 guns were supposed to fire a barrage on the evening of 10th of December 1971. Okay? And they were to be coordinated by the Krishak aircraft being flown by our man, Lieutenant General Narayan Chatterjee. And there were a lot of briefings there. All secrecy was maintained, and the story is a little long there. But he gets airborne. He gets a frequency from the BM of 10 RT Brigade. He takes the frequency and keeps it with him. Flies, and he calls up all the 6 stations to be ready. When he says all station 6 from so and so over, no reply. So there's a little bit of panic in the cockpit. He goes around, keeps trying. Time is 17:30 was the time for the firing that he's been briefed about. The people on ground don't know when to start the firing. So he's the guy who's supposed to tell them to start. Because our own troops have to disengage a little bit before the RT barrage comes in. So he didn't know what to do. And he was orbiting. Finally he decided, so he had this leather satchel with him in the aircraft, which was used to post letters by these guys used to put all the confidential mail also used to go there, and they used to drop it over the brigade headquarters or wherever they were supposed to. So he put this little chit that he had, the frequency wala chit, put it in this bag, and he dropped the bag over the 10 RT Brigade headquarters from his aeroplane. And then after a few seconds, all stations came on live on the radio. What had happened was there was a mismatch of frequency. The last digit or second digit was wrongly told, or whatever happened in the briefing, I don't know. But obviously they were on different frequencies. So when they came up on frequency, there was a sigh of relief and amen. Then they let go. The RT barrage happened. 108 guns fired on Cham. Cham was saved by this firing. So I'd say that Cham was saved because of this little piece of chit, this little chit that was thrown from an aeroplane. Because if he hadn't been able to transmit, there was no way that operation would have gone through, right? So he orbited there, and the firing happened. And when he came back, Jammu was under threat. So Jammu runway had been blocked by the station commander there, because they had said that the para commanders are going from aeroplanes are going from Pakistan are going to land at Jammu airfield. So he blocked the runway. The man could come and land at his own base. So that's a different story. He comes in and he's out of fuel. It's getting to be night. Those aircraft don't fly at night. But he flies, and then they clear the runway a little bit for him, and comes and lands. So this story, I really find it very intriguing because, saved by a chit, I call it. And I find it very intriguing and something which had not been told kind of in books that such a thing happened. So I find it, for 71 Ops, this is one of the nice stories that I wrote. Yeah.
Beautiful time, beautiful stories. So today I have sat through a storytelling session. This was not just a conversation, a discussion with you, but it was like storytelling and listening to combat stories, strategy stories, stories from your life, and absolutely fantastic. Time has just flown.
I know. It's really.
I'm definitely going to do another podcast with you, sir, because I don't think we've even touched the surface when it comes to stories from your life. And for my audience, I urge that you please check out Ekomodo, Nitin Sathe's books online on Amazon and wherever they are available. I am sure it's going to be a life-changing read for each one of you. Please enjoy this podcast, go through it, watch it over and over again, read the books he's written. And for my young audience, I always say that, I hope for those who are watching it are inspired enough to join the army, join the Navy, or join the Air Force, because the armed forces in our country is not a job. It's a way of life. And eventually it is a family, and everyone knows everyone, and it is a beautiful life to lead. Till then, thank you very much. And please share, like, and subscribe to Arun Bhagwati Chronicles. Click on the link wherever it is available. Till we meet next time. Thank you.